The first snow came earlier than anyone expected. Evelyn Harper stood on the porch of her isolated mountain cabin and watched the sky turn the color of brushed steel. The wind carried a dry, electric chill that stung her cheeks and whispered warnings through the pine trees. The weather reports had predicted a storm, but not like this. Not the kind that closed highways. Not the kind that snapped power lines. Not the kind that erased small towns from the map for weeks. But Evelyn didn't panic. She had been preparing for this winter for nearly 3 years. While her neighbors had invested in thicker insulation and backup generators, Evelyn had done something different, something no one knew about. Beneath her cabin, hidden under the old cedar floorboards and concealed by a custom-built trapdoor, she had constructed a reinforced underground room. A room no one had ever seen. And she had built it for a storm exactly like this. 3 winters ago, after a near-fatal cold snap left her without power for 5 days, Evelyn realized something simple. Surface solutions fail when the surface collapses. Generators freeze. Propane runs out. Wood piles get buried. But underground, the earth holds its temperature. She began researching soil insulation, thermal mass, passive heating, and emergency storm shelters. What started as curiosity slowly turned into blueprints sketched on yellow legal pads. When neighbors asked why lumber deliveries kept arriving in late spring, she smiled and said she was renovating. Technically, she was, but not in any way they imagined. At night, after finishing remote work, she lifted carefully cut planks in her living room and climbed down into a shallow excavation she had begun by hand. She worked quietly, deliberately, patiently, because she wasn't building a bunker. She was building survival. The room was not large, just 12 feet by 10, but every inch had purpose. The walls were reinforced with treated timber and sealed with vapor barriers. Rigid foam insulation lined the interior, and compacted gravel beneath the floor prevented moisture buildup. A small, vented air exchange pipe ran discreetly through the side foundation, hidden behind stacked firewood outside. She installed shelving for food storage, battery-powered lanterns, thermal blankets, water containers, a compact rocket stove designed for safe indoor ventilation. And most importantly, she installed a thick, insulated hatch disguised seamlessly within her living room floor. When closed, no one would suspect anything. It was her secret, and as the wind began to scream across the valley that night, it became her advantage. By midnight, the storm had transformed from snowfall to white fury. Wind gusts rattled the windows so violently that the glass trembled inside its frame. Snow piled against the front door faster than she could shovel. At 2:17 a.m., the power failed. The cabin fell silent except for the roar of the storm. Evelyn lit a lantern and didn't hesitate. She moved calmly, methodically. She gathered her emergency pack, sealed the wood stove, and pulled the living room rug aside. The trapdoor opened with a soft wooden sigh. Cold air hovered above. Warm earth waited below. She climbed down and pulled the hatch shut. The sound of the blizzard faded instantly. The earth swallowed the chaos. Morning arrived without sunlight. Above ground, the storm intensified. Snow buried cabins up to their windows. Roads vanished. Emergency services shut down. Inside her underground room, however, the temperature remained steady. 48 degrees without heat. 62 once she lit the compact stove. The insulation held. The earth radiated quiet warmth. The air remained breathable through the concealed vent. She listened to the radio updates, powered by store batteries. Multiple homes reported frozen pipes. Several families were relocated, those who could be reached. Others were simply unreachable. Evelyn wrapped herself in a wool blanket, sipped warm tea, and watched the small, controlled flame inside her stove. For the first time since moving to the mountains, she didn't feel vulnerable. She felt prepared. And above her, the blizzard continued, merciless, relentless, and unaware that one cabin refused to surrender. By the second day, the silence became heavier than the storm. Evelyn woke to stillness. No wind, no cracking branches, no distant hum of plows, just pressure. She climbed halfway up the ladder and pressed her ear to the hatch. Nothing. That was worse than noise. Carefully, she pushed the insulated door open an inch. Snow pressed against it. The entire front half of the cabin was buried. Light filtered in through a thin blue glow reflecting off walls of snow stacked nearly to the ceiling. The weight of it bowed the windows inward. She sealed the hatch again. Above ground was no longer shelter. It was a liability. On the emergency band, a strained voice repeated the same warning. If you are without heat, conserve energy and seek insulated space. Avoid exposure. Rescue operations are suspended until conditions improve. Suspended. That word lingered. Evelyn adjusted the antenna and caught fragments of nearby transmissions, crackling calls for neighboring properties. One voice stood out. Thomas Reed. He lived half a mile downhill with his elderly father. We've lost heat. Pipes burst, running out of wood. Static swallowed the rest. Evelyn closed her eyes. She had built the underground room for one, but she had supplies for more. The decision took less than a minute. Preparation meant nothing if you ignored people. She layered thermal gear, secured climbing rope around her waist, and tied the other end to the base of her staircase inside the cabin. If she fell into a drift or lost orientation in the wideout, the rope would guide her back. Opening the front door required force. Snow cascaded inward like sand. The world outside had transformed into a frozen canyon, drifts towering above her shoulders, wind-carved ridges sharp as sculpture. Each step toward Thomas's cabin felt like pushing through resistance, training in ice. Breathing burned. Visibility narrowed. Time stretched. When she reached his porch, she pounded on the door. It opened slowly. Thomas's face was pale. I didn't think anyone would make it, he said. You're coming with me, she replied. Bringing them back was harder. Thomas supported his father while Evelyn broke trail through her previous path, following the rope as if it were a lifeline, which it was. Inside her cabin, she didn't explain. She simply pulled back the rug. Thomas stared. What is that? Our heat, she answered. They descended carefully. When a hatch sealed above them, the transformation was immediate. Still air. Contained warmth. Light steady and controlled. Thomas's father exhaled shakily. It's warm, he whispered. Evelyn nodded. The ground doesn't panic, she said. It holds steady. The room felt smaller with 3 people, but it felt alive. Evelyn rationed supplies with calm precision. Water measured. Fuel monitored. Ventilation checked every 2 hours. Thomas listened to the radio while his father rested beneath layered blankets. By nightfall, official reports confirmed what Evelyn already knew. This was the worst blizzard in 42 years. Power infrastructure across the region had collapsed. Road access remained impossible. Rescue efforts would not begin for at least 72 hours. Thomas looked at her across the small underground space. You planned for this, he said quietly. Evelyn stared at the insulated walls around them. A plan for failure, she answered. Above them, the mountain remained buried. But beneath it, 3 steady heartbeats endured. And for now, that was enough. Time underground moved differently. Without sunrise or sunset, the hours blended into routine. Vent check, fuel check, snow pressure assessment, ration inventory. Evelyn kept a small notebook and logged everything. Temperature fluctuations, battery percentages, airflow adjustments. Control was calm, and calm kept fear from spreading. Thomas began to understand that the room was more than insulation and timber. It was discipline. Above them, the snowpack deepened. The mountain carried the weight silently. On the 4th day, a sound interrupted the quiet rhythm. A low groan. Not from the wind, not from the stove, from the cabin structure above. Snow was shifting, compressing. Thomas looked toward the ceiling instinctively. Is it going to collapse? Evelyn paused before answering. The roof might, she said calmly. But this room won't. She had reinforced the underground ceiling with crossbeams rated far beyond residential standards. The weight of the cabin itself distributed pressure across the foundation walls. Still, every creak carried tension. They listened as something heavy slid across the roof overhead. Then silence returned. The earth remained steady. By night, condensation gathered near the ventilation pipe. Evelyn noticed the change immediately. Air felt thicker, The external vent was likely buried deeper now. She reduced stove output, minimized flame, increased passive airflow through the secondary intake she had installed but never needed, until now. Thomas watched her work with precise efficiency. "You thought of everything," he said. "I thought of most things," she corrected. Prepared didn't mean invincible. It meant adaptable. The room stabilized again. Oxygen levels remained safe, but the margin narrowed. On the sixth day, the radio crackled with a new message. Aerial assessment teams deploying at first clear break. Mark your location if visible. Visible. That was the problem. Her cabin was likely indistinguishable from the snowfield. Evelyn made a decision. At dawn, if dawn could be measured by her watch rather than sunlight, she would surface briefly. Risky. Necessary. Layered again in thermal gear, tether secured, she pushed the hatch open. Snow had compacted hard as concrete. She tunneled upward using a collapsible shovel stored precisely for this scenario. It took 40 minutes to break through. When she emerged, the world was blinding white. The sky had cleared. She planted a bright orange emergency marker on the highest visible drift and ignited a controlled smoke flare designed for search visibility. Gray signal rose sharply against blue sky. For the first time in days, sunlight touched her face. Then she descended again. They heard it before they believed it. A distant vibration. Low. Rhythmic. Thomas froze. "Do you hear that?" Evelyn nodded slowly. Rotor blades. The sound grew louder, circling, searching. Snow dust filtered down from the ceiling as the helicopter passed overhead once, then again. The radio burst alive. Visual on signal marker near Pine Ridge sector. Survivors likely sheltered below. Ground extraction teams mobilizing. Thomas let out a breath he had been holding for nearly a week. His father squeezed Evelyn's hand. She didn't smile. Not yet. Rescue wasn't arrival. It was process. And she had built her room for endurance, not optimism. Still, as the rotor sound faded into coordinated response, something shifted underground. Hope, like warmth, spreads quietly. And this time, it spread to all three of them. The helicopter did not land. It circled once more, then disappeared beyond the ridge. Thomas's shoulders tensed. "They're leaving." Evelyn adjusted the radio volume. "Negative on airlift," the dispatcher announced. "Snow depth unstable for landing. Ground team inbound with thermal scanning. ETA unknown." Unknown. The word settled heavily in the small room. Rescue was coming, but not immediately. Evelyn recalculated supplies. Food, for more days at reduced portions. Water, sufficient. Fuel, limited but manageable. They could outlast uncertainty. They already had. Late that evening, it finally happened. A deep, violent crack split the air above them. Then a thunderous crash. Dust filtered down from the ceiling beams. Thomas instinctively shielded his father. Evelyn held still, listening. The roof had given way. Snow poured into the main cabin, but the underground structure held. The reinforced beams absorbed the shock exactly as designed. After several long seconds, the movement stopped. Silence returned. Thomas looked at her, eyes wide. "If we had stayed upstairs." "We didn't," she interrupted gently. Prepared didn't mean lucky. It meant alive. Temperatures dropped further after the collapse. Without the cabin acting as partial insulation above, cold seeped downward faster. Evelyn increased stove output slightly, but monitored oxygen carefully. Every decision now carried tighter margins. Thomas's father began coughing, a dry, persistent sound born from cold air and stress. Evelyn mixed warm water with honey from her sealed stores and kept him layered in thermal blankets. They took turns sleeping. No one rested deeply. The longest nights aren't always the coldest. They're the ones where you measure survival in breaths. At dawn, judged again only by the steady ticking of Evelyn's watch, they heard something new. Crunching, rhythmic, closer than the helicopter had been. Footsteps. Voices followed, muffled at first, then clearer. Thermal reading below this section. Thomas shot to his feet. Evelyn climbed the ladder and struck the hatch 3 times with the metal end of her flashlight. A pause, then pounding in response. "We hear you. Stay back." Snow shifted. Tools scraped. Light pierced through a widening seam as rescuers carved a vertical shaft down toward the hatch. For the first time in 7 days, fresh air rushed in without calculation. The hatch opened slowly from above. Blinding daylight flooded the underground room. A rescuer in insulated orange gear peered down. "You're the ones who set the marker?" Evelyn nodded. "3 survivors," she said calmly. They were lifted out one at a time using a secured harness system. When Evelyn emerged last, she saw what remained of her cabin. Half the roof had collapsed inward. Snow filled the living room entirely. Only the outer walls still stood. The structure looked defeated. But beneath it, unseen and intact, the reinforced chamber remained whole. A medic wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders. "You're lucky," he said. Evelyn glanced back at the buried hatch. "No," she replied quietly. "I was ready." In the days that followed, officials would call it foresight. Neighbors would call it extreme. News reporters would call it remarkable. But Evelyn knew the truth. When the surface fails, the earth remembers how to hold. And because she trusted that, she was the only one who stayed warm during the blizzard. The storm made national news. A once-in-a-generation blizzard. Record snowfall. Infrastructure collapse across 3 counties. Helicopter footage showed entire neighborhoods swallowed in white. Evelyn watched from a temporary shelter set up at the high school gymnasium in the nearest town. Rows of cots lined the basketball court. Generators hummed loudly, trying to compensate for what had failed. Thomas sat beside her, his father resting comfortably under medical supervision. Reporters moved carefully between survivors. When they reached her, the first question was simple. "How did you stay warm?" Evelyn hesitated. Then she answered, "I built below the frost line." 3 days later, once roads reopened, officials escorted her back to the mountain. The cabin looked worse in daylight. The roof had collapsed entirely inward. Snow packed tightly against fractured beams and broken rafters. But when the debris was carefully removed and the hatch uncovered, the underground room stood untouched. Dry, stable, intact. An emergency management officer descended first. He ran his gloved hand along the reinforced beams. "This held through that load?" Evelyn nodded. Cross-braced joists. Load distributed to foundation walls. Earth insulation reduced thermal shock. He looked up at her. "You didn't just survive. You engineered this." She didn't correct him. Word spread quickly. Neighbors who once teased her about overbuilding now asked detailed questions. How deep? How ventilated? What materials? How much did it cost? Evelyn answered every question carefully. Preparation, she explained, wasn't paranoia. It was probability. Storm patterns were intensifying. Power grids were aging. Supply chains were fragile. "The surface is convenient," she told a small group gathered near the remains of her porch. "But it's not always reliable." Within weeks, 3 neighbors began planning their own reinforced shelters. Thomas volunteered to help. Insurance covered part of the structural damage. The rest, Evelyn invested deliberately. The new cabin would not simply replace the old one. It would integrate with the underground chamber. This time, access would be reinforced steel. This time, dual ventilation shafts. This time, solar battery backups linked directly to the subterranean system. She expanded the room slightly, enough for 6 occupants instead of 3. Not because she expected disaster, but because she understood capacity. The mountain had taught her something clear. Isolation is a choice. Resilience can be shared. By the following winter, the new cabin stood complete. From the outside, it looked ordinary. Wood siding, stone chimney, wide porch facing the valley. No visible sign of reinforcement. No hint of what lay beneath. One evening, as light snow drifted gently from the sky, Thomas stopped by with his father, now fully recovered. They shared tea by the rebuilt fireplace. "Do you think another storm like that will come?" Thomas asked. Evelyn looked toward the mountains. "Yes," she said simply. He smiled faintly. "Are you ready?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached down, lifted the corner of the rug slightly, and let it fall back into place. The secret room below remained warm, steady, and waiting. Prepared, not for fear, but for reality. And when the next blizzard eventually arrived, sweeping across the valley with familiar force, one cabin again refused to surrender. Because beneath it, someone had built for what others hoped would never happen. The alert came in late January. Not as dramatic as the first. Not unexpected, but serious. A polar front was moving faster than predicted. Wind gusts projected above 60 miles per hour. Temperatures expected to drop below zero for 3 consecutive nights. Evelyn read the forecast twice. Then she began her checklist. Vent clearance, battery charge levels, water reserves, fuel rotation. This time, she wasn't preparing alone. Thomas had already texted, "If it turns bad, we're heading up." She replied with a simple, "Room is ready." The storm arrived hard, but not catastrophic. Snow accumulated steadily. Wind sculpted the drifts into familiar shapes. By evening, Thomas and his father arrived before conditions worsened. They didn't wait for crisis. They descended early. Inside the expanded underground room, the atmosphere felt different from the first time. Less fear, more structure. Shelving had been upgraded. Cots installed. Ventilation automated with manual overrides. This wasn't improvisation anymore. It was infrastructure. Near midnight, an unexpected sound interrupted the steady hum of the air system. Knocking, not from above, from outside the main cabin door. All 3 froze. Evelyn climbed halfway up the ladder and listened. The knocking came again, weak but deliberate. Someone had attempted to reach the cabin during the storm. She made a quick decision. Thomas secured the rope tether while she surfaced cautiously. Opening the door revealed a figure half buried in snow, a delivery driver from the highway below, whose vehicle had slid off the road. He was conscious but shaking violently. There was no debate. Within minutes, he was lowered into the underground room. For heartbeats now echoed beneath the cabin. The expanded chamber proved its purpose. For people fit tightly, but safely. The driver, Marcus, regained color slowly as warmth stabilized his core temperature. "I saw the light in your window," he said weakly. "Didn't think anyone lived this far up." Evelyn handed him warm broth. "We do," she said. Through the night, the storm intensified. But below ground, systems held steady. Temperature constant, air balanced, fuel consumption efficient. The room no longer felt like a secret. It felt like a responsibility. By morning, plows cleared the lower highway. Rescue crews escorted Marcus safely back to town. Before leaving, he paused at the cabin door. "You should teach this," he said. "More people need to know how to do this." The comment lingered long after the storm passed. Over the following weeks, Evelyn began hosting small workshops in town. Practical sessions on thermal design, underground insulation, emergency ventilation, and realistic preparedness. Attendance grew, not out of fear, but out of understanding. The mountain winters weren't becoming gentler. They were becoming predictable in their severity. And beneath one ordinary-looking cabin stood proof that preparation wasn't extreme. It was transferable. When the next advisory warning eventually flashed across the county alert system, fewer people panicked. Because resilience had started spreading quietly, steadily, just like warmth beneath the frost line. Spring brought something Evelyn hadn't prepared for. Attention! A regional news segment featured her underground design. The clip spread online faster than she expected. Comments poured in. Brilliant. Extreme. Paranoid. Visionary. A state emergency preparedness coordinator reached out, requesting a visit. Evelyn hesitated. The room had always been private, but privacy had shifted into responsibility long ago. She agreed. 3 vehicles arrived one clear morning. Engineers, emergency planners, a structural specialist. They walked the perimeter first, examining soil grading, foundation reinforcement, and ventilation exits disguised along the stone line. Then Evelyn lifted the rug. The group descended carefully. Clipboards emerged. Measurements were taken. Photos documented load-bearing beams and airflow channels. "You built this without formal contracting?" one engineer asked. "With research," Evelyn replied. "And patience." They were impressed, but cautious. Scaling something like this would require regulation, permits, updated safety codes. Preparedness at community scale was more complicated than individual foresight. Not everyone welcomed the idea. At the next town council meeting, debate filled the room. "We can't turn every home into a bunker," one resident argued. "This isn't fear-based," Thomas responded from the back row. "It's climate-based." Insurance representatives raised concerns about liability. Contractors raised concerns about cost. Evelyn listened more than she spoke. When she finally stood, the room quieted. "This isn't about hiding from the world," she said. "It's about reinforcing it. Storms are data. We either respond to it or we ignore it." Silence followed. Change rarely begins with consensus. It begins with proof. By early summer, the county drafted a pilot program. Voluntary subterranean storm rooms. Standardized ventilation requirements. Load calculations verified by licensed engineers. Evelyn reviewed the proposal carefully. Her original design would serve as the template, but adjusted for safety compliance and accessibility. She insisted on one addition: shared capacity guidelines. "If someone builds one," she told the coordinator, "it should protect more than just them." The amendment passed. Late August brought heavy rain instead of snow. Unusual for the elevation. Persistent. Unrelenting. Runoff began saturating slopes that were usually dry by midsummer. Evelyn monitored soil reports closely. Snow was predictable. Water was not. One evening, a low rumble echoed across the valley. Not thunder. Movement. A minor landslide struck a neighboring hillside. No injuries, but structural damage significant. For the first time, Evelyn studied her underground chamber from a new angle. It had been designed for cold, but resilience must evolve. As rain continued to fall, she opened her notebook again. Preparedness wasn't a finished project. It was a living one, and the next chapter would not be about surviving winter. It would be about adapting to everything else. The rain continued for 9 days. Not violent, not dramatic, persistent. Evelyn monitored soil saturation levels using newly installed moisture sensors around the cabin's foundation. What had once been a winter-only design was now evolving into a year-round resilient system. She added perimeter drainage trenches, installed a sump system with gravity-fed backup, reinforced exterior grading to redirect runoff away from structural load points. Preparedness was no longer about surviving a single event. It was about anticipating patterns, and patterns were changing. In early fall, a severe weather system stalled over the region. Heavy rain triggered flash flooding along the lower highway. Mudslides closed 2 access roads. Power outages followed as saturated ground toppled utility poles. This time, emergency alerts reached phones before conditions escalated, but response still lagged behind impact. 3 families from lower elevation properties evacuated uphill toward Evelyn's cabin. She didn't hesitate. The underground chamber, now expanded and upgraded, welcomed them. 8 people settled below ground. Ventilation steady. Drainage operational. Interior dry. Above, water rushed across the mountainside. Below, systems held. When conditions stabilized days later, something had changed in the valley. Preparedness was no longer theoretical. 4 additional homes had begun excavation for compliant underground storm rooms under the county's pilot program. Local contractors received specialized training. Emergency management updated guidelines. What began as one woman's private safeguard had evolved into regional adaptation. Evelyn never intended to lead anything. She simply refused to ignore what the environment was teaching. One quiet evening months later, snow began falling again. Soft, measured, unhurried. Evelyn stood on her porch, watching flakes settle across reinforced roofing and carefully graded earth. The cabin looked ordinary, but beneath it lived something extraordinary, not because it was hidden, but because it was intentional. The secret room was no longer just a chamber of warmth. It was proof of a mindset. Anticipate, adapt, share. The mountain would always test those who lived on it. But tests lose their power when you prepare before they arrive. Years later, newcomers to the valley would hear the story. About the blizzard that buried roofs. About the collapse that trapped homes. About the cabin that endured. So call it foresight. Others would call it engineering. Evelyn called it listening. Listening to climate data. Listening to structural limits. Listening to probability instead of comfort. On the coldest nights, when wind swept across the valley with familiar force, she would sometimes lift the corner of the rug and glance at the sealed hatch below. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because survival isn't dramatic when done correctly. It is quiet. It is measured. It is built before it is needed. And beneath one unassuming mountain cabin, warmth remained steady. Not because the storm showed mercy, but because someone had decided, long before the snow fell, to build beneath the surface.